Hi, in this presentation, we're going to take a look at why context is so important to understanding conversations and how it affects the meaning of what we're saying. So stay tuned for this very important presentation. Okay, so the importance of context is today's presentation. On the website, we have many presentations on many other aspects of the project, but today we're going to focus on this single point. Some notes before we get started. This was actually the first time this presentation has been shown, but this has been shown for a second time today. It is being recorded so you can relax and absorb. It does often take watching some of these concepts 2 or 3 times before they really become very clear. What I think we need to do, we need to acknowledge the complex, difficult nature of conversations and messaging. It is very complex at its deep levels, and what we're looking to do on this project is to make it very practically usable, a lot of the information, so we can use it very simply. We can find ways through, but we need to acknowledge how difficult and unfair the situation is and move forward. And what I mean by that is that if we're having a conversation with another person, we are looking to understand why that conversation is not working, why it's not successful. The other person is unlikely to do this, because when 2 people have a conversation, the general bias is to assume that we're correct and the other person is wrong. And for us to understand why that occurs allows us to really to have much more successful conversations. So context. When I was trying to describe what context is to me and how complex it is, for me, context is like an invisible slippery fish. Once grasped, you will truly increase your understanding of every situation. So it really is, a lot of the time, it's hard to quantify, it's hard to grab hold of. Changing the context can and often does change the meaning of data and information. Context is the invisible set of assumptions, terms, and definitions which define the meaning of a word, a sentence, a concept, or an event. So one of the things that I found pretty much true to nearly every doctor, scientist, or academic that I spoke to is that at the start of the narrative, they saw many, many holes, and they assumed all I have to do is share the facts and then people will change their views. I think we can really acknowledge that isn't the case. The proof is in the pudding that so much of official messaging lacks facts, but has been very persuasive, and so much of those challenging the narrative with very solid facts has had little effect in many instances. So if we look at the origin of the word context, it's really derived from 2 Latin words. The first is con, which means together. So you can take 2 random items, put them together, then the context changes. And it's the word texere, which is meaning to weave. So effectively, the things around the things that we focus on when we bring them together change the meaning of the thing that we're looking at. That's really the essence of it. So its definition is in or amid the surrounding words, the setting or event that gives something its complete, original, or genuine meaning. This is so key and so profound for so many reasons, is that when we understand what's governing the meaning for people of the facts and the words that we're saying and we're sharing, we will see why they're interpreting it differently to how we think it actually is. So for instance, if I say the word Paul, okay, on its own, it's ambiguous, it can mean many things. It's when I say I played Paul, now it has a context. It has that, I'm playing this game of pool. And separately, if I say the word pool and I say I swam in the pool, now it's a completely different picture, a completely different meaning to that word. Okay, and obviously when you start to apply this understanding to a lot of the facts around the narrative, you'll see that the context in which the fact is shared actually distorts the fact significantly. So context affects. The content effects is the influence that our environment, the information plays on us intellectually, emotionally, and even physically. So here I'm going to share a famous picture, which is these 2 orange dots are the same size, but the information and the objects around it actually shapes how we see that. So what you have is the surrounding information distorts our perception of the point of focus. So in this instance, the orange dot looks different because of the things surrounding it, the context in which it's shown. The context shapes the information. Context not only shapes what our mouths see, but what our brains think and interpret. Okay, and here's a funny picture, is that from two different perspectives, it's a completely different context. The person on the island says, oh, wait, a boat, and the person on the boat is looking for land. So to give you quite an interesting story that demonstrates this, there's a lady on a train and there's two children, and they're playing up and they're making lots of noise. And the woman turns to the father and says, excuse me, can you keep control of your children? And the father replies, I'm sorry, we've just been to their mother's funeral and I don't know what to do. Within that short space of time, the context of their behavior by the end of the story is completely different. It's completely changed due to information surrounding that focal point of the children playing up. So what we want to do is, it's a very complex thing, but we want to demonstrate a simple way of viewing context and frames within the conversations that we have. And what we decided to do is that we're going to show the yellow frame as to be the point of focus, and the green frame is to be that around the focus, that surrounding information which contains the context and assumptions which influence what's in the yellow box. Makes sense? So the green box is all these assumptions that are often outside of our awareness, but they're going to change the meaning of what's in the yellow box. And then we're going to take a look at some very important examples that will really explain why this is so important. The area between the yellow and the green is the least understood, the least seen. It's the hidden assumptions, but it's probably the most important because it will govern what the information in the yellow box means. So here's an example. So there was a study, and it was the percentage chance of survival after 1 month of a surgery. So what you found is that on this scale of 0 to 100%, there was a 90% survival of the patient after the surgery, which resulted in, on the other side of the coin, a 10% mortality rate risk. Now, what they found was that when they described the information to the doctors showing the 90% survival, what happened was that 84% of the doctors would choose that surgery going forward. If, and obviously there's many reasons why that's the case, but if they focused and told the doctors of the 10% mortality, what actually happened was that it significantly changed how many doctors would advise that surgery. It went down to 50%. Now, from an objective measurement, these numbers are effectively the same, but the way in which they presented changes the decision significantly. This is really, really key. So the framing effect, as it's known, is where we're presented with two or more options which are essentially the same, but the way they are presented is different and changes our interpretation of the information. So if you look back through the narrative, you'll see that the way that they present in the numbers has significantly affected how people interpreted those numbers. And it's not been done by accident. This is really well known in so many circles within the behavioral sciences. And since the behavioral sciences advised so many of the governments, this has been done very much intentionally. And what we see is that we tend to value options that are framed positively. We also tend, and these are the items that are in the green box, so these are the unseen assumptions that our brain will make most of the time. We tend to choose options with higher values as our bias believes that higher is better. And this is often used in conjunction with social proof. So a lot of people will do generally what the majority will do. So it's in the interest of people presenting the numbers to really make the most positive side be the interpreted one. So this was taken from a study of Kahneman and Tversky in conjunction with Harvard Medical School. But this has been replicated many times in many different situations, and it's essentially always shows that there is a distortion in interpretation of numbers depending on where the frame and the focus is. So here's a second example, and this is really the media effect on data, and this is quite mind-blowing. So if we take a couple of headlines, and we've got some fun ones here which are quite comedy. So homicide victims rarely talk to police, and on one hand, mine applauds the kindness of strangers. So participants in a study were shown various news headlines, and they were to rate them on believability and credibility on a 7-point scale. 1 for most credible, 7 for least credible. Each headline was rotated between 4 news magazines. Now, this allowed the researchers to assess how context, i.e. which magazine it was in, affected credibility. Now, what turned out was the scores were significantly different between the magazines, even though it was the same headline. The most respected magazine saw an average of credibility of 1.9, and the least respected is 5.5. It was less important where what the information was, and it was really important where the information was displayed. The information is not processed neutrally. It is biased, and it is biased significantly. So we see this in that's gone on in the the narrative, that where information is shown is so tightly controlled, and of course, if it's off the beaten path, people tend to dismiss it. And this was from a study from neurologist Michael Depp at the University of Munster, 2005. Now, the third example that we're going to show is really the group identity effect on meaning. This is one of the most profound ones that would affect our conversations. So this was a study that was done in 2015 in the UK during the general election by Jenny Rodell and Richard Shodden, and they surveyed voters. What they said was they proposed adding a penny to the VAT rate in the UK, which is the value-added tax on all purchases, of a penny, and they were told, and the participants were told, that this would fund 10,000 extra nurses. Half of the participants were told it was a Conservative Party policy, and half of them were told it was a Labour policy. Of the Labour supporters surveyed, 14% of them completely agreed when they were told it was a Labour policy, yet only 3% of them agreed when they were told it was a Conservative policy. So there was almost 5-fold change on the information when it was come from a different source. The same occurred in the Tory supporters. The party supporters were 4 times more likely to support the idea if it was coming from the party they supported. This is quite profound, because when we think about the source of the information and our identity to the group of the source or opposing the source, significantly changes how we view it. And we would have seen this obviously within the narrative. If you are labeled anti-XYZ in opposition to the mainstream, unconsciously, people will be literally changing their view of the information that you're presenting. So how does this affect the conversations that we have and also the messaging? So, as we've shown in many times on the project, a typical conversation between Joe Bloggs and Jane Bloggs is that Jane will present a fact, and that fact will bounce back. And there's many reasons we'll show why that happens. But this really, for this presentation, we're just going to show this is the typical conversation. Now, what happens is in conversations is that we stand on soapbox, which is what we believe to be true, and we project that into the conversation. If it turns out that the technology exists, and we believe it does, we've seen it with our own eyes, to actually install information in a person's soapbox without their awareness, they are going to present that information to the conversation as though it is true. So if Joe believes that 2 + 2 = 5, no amount of conscious reasoning with him that 2 + 2 = 4 is going to make any difference. The goal is to get information into his soapbox to enrich his map, so he sees things more balanced. So what we see, if we use our understanding of frames and context in a simple dialogue here, we will see that if Joe says you are anti-leech, and make context of that as you will, what will happen is that if we focus on that sentence, we will miss what's actually really going on. So if we look at the green box, which is all the hidden assumptions in that sentence, and if we map them out, we can see the context and the assumptions for that sentence to make sense is going to be Joe identifies as pro-leech. Joe considers pro-leech the right solution. Joe considers anti-leech incorrect position. Joe considers anti-leech an opposition to his group, potentially, and that's, I think, happening a lot of the time. Joe may consider anti-leech people immoral. That's certainly been a narrative in certain situations. And Joe considers the topic black and white. You can only be one or the other. You can't be in the middle. You can't assess them one by one. And obviously, that doesn't follow logical principles, but that's what's going on. Joe, in his mind, has a caricature in what the person he's talking to is. So if we zoom out and we actually put the yellow box of the focus on the conversation itself, so we're not going to look from our perspective, we're going to look at the conversation perspective. Then what we see is the assumption here is that these people are in oppositional dynamics. And we have a presentation where we describe this in detail. And what this means is all the empirical studies show that if you have two people define themselves in two different groups and those groups in opposition, the person will ignore every piece of information coming from the opposing group. Unless this gets reversed during the conversation, until we orientate ourselves to the person we're talking to and they orientate themselves to us, it does not matter, in my opinion, what information you share. It has almost a zero chance of getting through because, in fact, the studies show that we will dismiss what they're saying. So this is really key. This is why the context, when you zoom out, when you look at it from a wider perspective and you start to understand the context of the conversation, you will understand why so many people are not listening. And this obviously goes very deep, but the process of today, we're just going to show a couple of examples. So in the second example, if Jane says there are so many XXX, Joe's response following the previous slide is going to be, who told you that? Karen from the park, very standard response. So if we look at that sentence and we start to look at the hidden assumptions there, we will see that Joe considers the source non-credible, okay? Joe considers Jane's sources to lack scientific rigor, only mainstream sources can be trusted, authorities wouldn't lie, etc., etc. What's interesting is that once you see the context that gives the meaning to Joe for this sentence, then we understand what we need to do in the conversation. We need to get this connection. We need to get into understand that some of these assumptions may not be true. And we have many stories to actually dismiss pretty much all of these assumptions. But if Joe doesn't have these assumptions questioned, if we don't question, you know, the terms anti-leech, pro-leech, if we don't get those reversed before we continue and we connect, there really isn't going to be much going on of a successful nature. But when we do reverse those, you'll see a connection and a conversation go completely differently. So in summary, context and assumptions which transform meaning are often outside of our awareness. It's really key that when we start to notice them, oh, when that person says that, what do I have to assume to be true for that to make sense? And then you'll start to see at a much deeper level what's behind the meaning for them. Understanding the common ones allow us to avoid them in many instances. We map them out in the 3 videos on conversational tips. So you can, there's so many trapdoors that we can avoid by understanding the common ones. And once we know the context and assumptions, we can find remedies to ensure information lands. And this was really why I envisaged groups together, getting together, and maybe start to advertising in mainstream, mainly to inform people where their information is coming from, how it's fact, all these things. These are things that we need to get over before people actually assess the information. So the project moving forward is focused on 3 things, which is 1, the element of conversations, which is largely complete, and we're going to redo it to be streamlined, but there's many videos on the website. We've also got the powerful messaging course, which is how to do the written word, the flyers, the emails, etc. And then finally, the project we're working on now is how we're influenced. We've mapped out all the cognitive biases. We've mapped out how they're being used to influence our perception and how people are having their perceptions influenced without their consent and without their knowledge. Presentations and the course are free on the website. Donations optional if you have benefited, you'd like to support us. Very much helps cover our costs. You can do so here. Reachingpeople.net for all the videos and information, and to contact me, info@reachingpeople.net.